change, adapt, and evolve on this episode of Battle Guides featuring Thessala. Thessala is a versatile mix-up character who has an amazing overdrive finisher that can dominate and obliterate opponents. However, that all comes at the cost of having no range, no movement, as well as needing proper management of her unique ability to work. Thessala's unique ability is Continuous Evolution. Long story short, Thessala has an evolution board and starts with a tracker in the center space. During the anti-phase as an anti, she may place a tracker on top of a space adjacent to a space that already has a tracker on it. You'll see that adjacency is defined by those lines between the hexagons. Now, when she does this, she gains the bonus on the space she covered for that beat. Remember, she can't place markers or trackers on spaces that are already occupied by a previous tracker. This unique ability is so confusing. There's so many bonuses that Thessala can gain from it that it's very impractical for me to just tell you guys each and every single one of them and how each and every single one of them can be very useful. As you can see, the evolution board basically has a lot of overlap on it. Certain effects are just other effects with bigger numbers, like Soak 1 compared to Soak 2, or Power plus 1 compared to Power plus 2, and other effects are just basically the same thing as other effects. Literally, copy-pasta effects just on different spaces on the board. Now, the thing about this unique ability is you just have to remember how to use it correctly. In reality, it's her unique ability that makes it very, very hard to understand what Thessala's trying to do. With this in mind, I highly recommend taking note of the following effects on your evolution board. Number 1. Ignore Stun Guard. Ignore Stun Guard or anything else that has Ignore Stun Guard on it is very powerful in BattleCON. Again, a lot of characters hinge on having Magical Stun Guard 3 in order to brunt an attack and trade with the opponent. As long as you're faster than the opponent, doing Ignore Stun Guard will allow Thessala to beat out almost anyone who is smart enough or confident enough to try and be slow against her. Keeping this option available to you, and by that I mean having a tracker adjacent to the space that says Ignore Stun Guard, is very powerful because it'll force your opponent to think twice about playing slow plays. This alone, without you even using the effect, can be more than enough to scare opponents away from doing their slow plays, and honestly, that's more than enough power for me. Next up is move directly adjacent to an opponent, as well as move directly to any unoccupied space. These two effects are quite powerful for Thessala for one main reason. She doesn't have a lot of movement on her cards, and these two effects allow her to compensate for that. Most of the time, your opponent will take advantage of your low mobility and low range, meaning that they'll often try to go to the opposite end of the board and pot-shot you to death. This is Thessala's way to counter that strategy. And the thing is, it allows Thessala to not only get hit confirmed, but as well as positioning advantage. Keep your trackers adjacent to these two effects in order to maximize your benefit from them, as if you do get into a sticky situation, you will easily have a get out of jail free card. Next up is start of beat, you become active player. This effectively means that Thessala will go first regardless of the priorities you and your opponent have. Just be very careful of opponents who have the same effect on their cards, as whoever activates their start of beat effect last goes first, if that makes any sense to you. Now, this thing is very powerful because it plays much like everything else I'm telling you here. It basically makes your opponent think twice about doing specific plays. In this situation, it makes them think twice about using their dash or any of their faster attacks against Thessala, who's not necessarily the fastest character outside of a specific style. This allows Thessala to capitalize on her opponent's weakness and wreck them. Of course, in the context of the force gauge, if your opponent has spent some force in order to get priority +2, you can obviously just do this one, and then suddenly they have wasted a lot of their resources for basically nothing. Next up is attacks at range 1 don't hit you. Much like Seraphina, this is basically an absurd way to force your opponent to never do melee attacks against you, especially against melee-oriented characters who have no range, much like Thessala herself. This can be very powerful in order to trade very well with your opponents or just make them miss for no reason at all. It's quite powerful, and keeping the option open to you will stray your opponent away from doing their most powerful melee attacks. And finally, we have damage you take is converted to life loss. If you guys don't remember how Oriana works or something like that, this effectively turns you immortal for a turn. You can't die via life loss, and that's very important to remember because all the damage you take is now converted to life loss, giving you one free more beat just in case your opponent kills you this turn. It's also very good because life loss does not contribute to stunning you, so it effectively reads you can't die this turn and you have stun immunity outside of getting on-hit stunned. So with that in mind, it's quite powerful and very useful to keep in the pocket. That is, if you find an opportunity to place a tracker adjacent to this effect, it can be quite good later on, especially when you're in dire straits. Now aside from this, Thessala's unique ability is way more than just making her unpredictable and forcing her opponents into mix-ups. Aside from the effects that I've just listed down, every single one of the spaces on the board effectively gives you certain amounts of stats, ranging from varying amounts of power, priority, soak, stun guard, range, and so on and so forth. These can heavily influence and change the way your attack pair works, which contributes again to your unpredictability, especially if you've littered your entire board with a bunch of trackers, because now your opponent basically has to wonder which of your 20 billion antis you're gonna pick for this turn. That alone can overload your opponent and make them make mistakes, and I know that's not necessarily something that you might think is a great advantage, but trust me, over the course of an entire game, it will wear them down. But more than this is also a good way of correcting your own attack pairs. Say your opponent has antied a lot of stun guard because they spent force to gain the overload that gives them stun guard. Or say you're up against an Eligor who just antied 4 tokens. Well, you see that and you're like, haha, then you just do ignore stun guard and then they suddenly lose. This is pretty much the other strength of Thessala's unique ability. The ability to adapt her attack pair based on her opponent's antis. By doing this in combination with her mix-up potential, you can absolutely dominate opponents who are not prepared to analyze like literally 20 billion attack pairs in one beat. Now let's move on to her styles. Let's start off with Molten. Molten has positive power and negative priority and stun guard too, making it an excellent defensive style. However, the thing about this is that it has an awesome passive effect that basically states that Thessala can place a tracker onto the board without gaining its effects if she gets hit. Now, you might wonder, how is that useful? Well, the thing is, sometimes Thessala wants to get access to certain effects on her evolution board without having to take so much time to get there. For example, the attacks at range 1 miss you effect is literally at the end of an evolution board. So if you want to get there fast and quick, this is the way to go. Just remember that this still follows the entire you can only put it in adjacent spaces that are already covered rule, because it would be broken otherwise. Now, when it comes to attack pairs, I highly recommend this thing with Shot. It's pretty obvious. It has plus power and stun guard too. Shot gives it a very, very good hit confirm, and it gives it a ton of damage, and the extra stun guard too. That will make it magical stun guard 3. What more could you want? And aside from that, I also highly recommend it with Strike. Now, it might not make a lot of sense for me to give you an attack pair that doesn't have a lot of hit confirm, but you're Thessala. Thessala can give literally almost any attack bonus range by using her evolution board, or bonus priority, or whatever. So, when your opponent is cornered and you feel like it's a great time to strike them from across the board using one of the evolution effects, or strike them when you've got them cornered, Molten Strike can be very powerful and provides good setup for Thessala the next beat. Next up is Slicing. Slicing has no stats and only one passive effect, but that one singular passive effect is a doozy. Opponents cannot retreat. Think about that. Opponents cannot retreat. This is a very, very powerful style because it effectively allows you to negate their burst and negate their dashes that go away from you. This is very powerful for Thessala, who literally has no range and no movement because you keep your opponents where they are. Now, it's just as simple as that. You use this to compensate for your lack of range and movement. Now, when it comes to attack pairs, I highly recommend this thing with Strike because it makes up for Strike's innate weakness to burst, but it does not make up for its innate weakness to grasp, so watch out for that. But the thing is, since you're Thessala, you can adapt this attack by just adding bonus range on top. However, if that's not your thing, you can easily pair it with grasp as well. It negates your innate weakness to burst, but not your innate weakness to shot. So if you feel like that's something you have to deal with, you can easily just do ignore stun guard or get bonus power to compensate. Next up is Tempered. Tempered has negative power but an awesome start of beat effect that gives Thessala +1 power for each covered space adjacent to the starting space. Effectively, it's those 4 blips that are next to the Thessala face on the evolution board. This effectively means that if you've covered all 4 of them, Tempered is simply a power +3 style with no drawbacks. That is freaking absurd, allowing you to cash out and deal so much damage to a lot of enemies. Now, the thing about this though is that you have to properly upgrade yourself to make Tempered good. But that's pretty much okay. Thessala's entire thing with her evolution board is all about getting multiple options. And most of the time, covering the 4 starting spaces, as I'd like to call them, is a very good way to go because it allows you the most amount of adaptability and variety for your evolution antis. Now, when it comes to attack pairs, I highly recommend this thing with Drive. Drive synergizes very well with the extra power because it gives it the hit confirm it so desperately needs, as well as the priority it may need just in case. However, with the onset of the Force Gauge, Thessala can also easily pair Tempered with Shot as well, allowing her to get Magical Stun Guard 3 and deal a ton of damage. Of course, that doesn't count her being really good with her evolution board and getting Soaken Stun Guard from that instead. Next up is Liquid. Liquid has negative power and Prio +2, and it has an awesome passive and end of beat effect. Passively, attacks at range X don't hit you, wherein X is your power, meaning that whatever your power is, opponents at that range can't hit you. So say you have, you pair this thing with Strike, that means opponents at range 3 can't hit you. Of course, that gets changed by random power bonuses, such as the ones from Force Gauge, and the ones from your evolution board as well. Now, besides that, end of beat, Thessala gets to basically teleport adjacent to the opponent. This is a very powerful style. Not only is it fast, not only does it let you dodge the opponent, it also gives you excellent positioning for the next beat. This style is literally almost unfair, and I think it's one of Thessala's best styles. It's very powerful, especially if you manage your power correctly. With Force Gauge and the evolution board in the game, you can easily finagle your power to make it so that your opponent will miss depending on what range you are at. Now, when it comes to attack pairs, I highly recommend pairing this with Grasp. Grasp plus evolution board range, plus evolution board power, plus Force Gauge power, so on and so forth, is very interesting with Liquid. Not only do you take advantage of the priority, you're also able to move your opponent around and ensure that they'll be in range of your passive effect to make them miss. Of course, this is very easy to do with Thessala because you have Force Gauge and evolution board now, which makes it very powerful to use. However, if that's not your thing, you can also easily pair it with Lash. Lash is Thessala's unique base, and this is very powerful because it has range 2 to 3, so you can finagle the power again to move the opponent around, especially if you have various range bonuses from your unique ability. However, do note one thing, is that Lash's on hit effect allows you to pull opponents past Thessala and then make them miss. Liquid's bonus priority synergizes with this effect very well, and is arguably the sole reason why I pair it with Liquid a lot. So keep that in mind and try to make your opponents miss when you use Liquid. Next up is Galvanized. Galvanized has priority -2 and an awesome start of beat effect and end of beat effect. Start of beat, you can remove up to 2 trackers from your evolution board and gain stun guard 2 for each one removed this way. This is a very powerful effect for 2 reasons. Number 1, this gives galvanize potentially stun guard 4, which is absurd, but more than that, it allows you to remove stuff from your evolution board. Meaning that if you've already used an effect such as the very good ignore stun guard, you can remove the tracker from it and then place the tracker on it next beat during the anti-phase to gain the effect once more. This allows you to double down on many of your effects and gives you stun guard as well. It's quite powerful. However, as an end of beat effect, you can still place a tracker down onto the board following the same rules, but again, you don't gain the effect. The thing about this though is it allows you to work your way towards one of the other bonuses on your evolution board. Again, much like Molten, this is a good way to set up for the next beat. Now when it comes to attack pairs, I highly recommend pairing this thing with Shot. Shot synergizes very well with the added stun guard, and that's pretty much it. Now if that's not your thing, you can also easily pair it with Drive because it gives it the hit confirm it so desperately needs. Besides, the thing is already magical stun guard 4 on its own, so you can pretty much pair any base with it. And finally, we have Thessala's unique base, Lash. Lash is a range 2 to 3, power 3, priority 3 attack, making it really mediocre in terms of stats. However, it makes up for it with awesome triggered effects. On hit, you can pull the opponent up to 2 spaces, and then if they switch sides with you because of this effect, they miss their attack. It's kind of like a reverse dash, making it quite powerful if your opponents are not prepared for it. However, if you also look at its on damage effect, you'll see how crazy this thing can get. Because on damage, you can place a tracker onto the evolution board, again following the same adjacency rules, and then you don't gain its effects. Lash is very powerful because not only does it bring opponents closer so that Thessala can go back into melee range, not only does it give Thessala a way to deal with slow opponents who are using shots and strikes against her, it also gives her a way to ramp up for one of her bigger effects the next beat. Be it your bonus powers, your ignore stun guards, your ignore soaks, whatever, you can ramp towards them with this effect, making it quite powerful indeed. Now when it comes to attack pairs, I highly recommend pairing this thing with Galvanized because it gives it magical stun guard 3, and Galvanized plus this can basically let you set up your evolution board crazily, allowing you to remove 2 and then put 2 down again, allowing you to essentially pick different sets of antis for the next turn. Or if that's not your thing, you can easily pair it with Liquid as well to make dodging the opponent that much easier. Thessala's 2 overdrive finishers are Deadlock and Slaughterhouse. Deadlock is a medium range overdrive finisher that has 6 power and 6 priority, making it one of the biggest statistically statted overdrives you can have. However, the thing about this is that its passive effect basically states that this doesn't work unless you covered a space on your evolution board wherein all the spaces adjacent to it are already covered. This is very complicated and very hard to finagle sometimes. And it also locks you into whatever that thing with all the filled adjacent ones is. So you lose the versatility of your unique ability for an overdrive finisher that has above average stats with limited range. It's not that good, but if you finagle it correctly and give it the bonus range, it can be very powerful. Now do note that the things at the edges of the board only have 1 space adjacent to them, making this the easiest quote-unquote way to get this overdrive to work. I can easily see it synergizing with the power plus 5 and the range plus 0 to 6, making it quite powerful if you get to those ends of the board. Just be very careful because it kinda gets predictable at that point. Now if that's not your thing, Slaughterhouse will absolutely be your thing. It's range 1, power 3, priority 4, with the best start of beat effect in the game, because you can place a tracker onto any space on the board, this time ignoring the adjacency rule, and then gain its effects. Basically, this turns into a cancel. You can see your opponent's attack pair and then adapt to whatever they've done by just anteing the appropriate space on your evolution board. Now this is very important to remember that this is start of beat, meaning that priority pluses will not benefit you at this point. So if you want to be faster than the opponent, you might want to keep the start of beat, become active player handy just in case. Now, one thing to note about this overdrive finisher is that it's melee range, meaning that if you are at range from the opponent, you might be forced to give this thing range in order to make it work, because otherwise you'll just have an attack that will miss most of the time. Now, remember, as with many unique abilities, your unique ability still applies to these overdrive finishers, meaning that you can synergize your extra range, extra power, extra priority with one another in order to make these two overdrive finishers that much more powerful. Now, when it comes to using the force gauge, the switch special action, as well as your pulse, Thessala has a decent time with all of them. Now, gaining the extra stats from the overloads might not seem that important, but it's very important as well. Not only does it allow Thessala to do really weird tricks with her liquid, it basically allows her to get the stats she needs if she needs to use range on her evolution board. Meaning that if you get range in the evolution board, sometimes you might need the bonus stun guard, sometimes you might need the bonus power, and so on and so forth. But aside from that, it's not that important to her because, again, she usually just has the stats from her styles or her evolution board or a combination of both, so she doesn't really spend a lot of force on that. Now, when it comes to using the special action, Switch is a godsend for Thessala. Literally all of her styles contribute to her mix-up game in some way, making the opponent miss with liquid, getting lots of stun guard with galvanize, or even making opponents not retreat with slicing. So, with that in mind, it's very good to have a blank style to pair with dash. Switch becomes Thessala's instant dash pair, and that's pretty much it, giving her more styles in her hand so that she can threaten her opponent with more mix-ups. And finally, we have Pulse. Thessala can get some use out of Pulse because it allows her to move herself, meaning that if she is in a desperate situation where her range is horrible, this would be a good way to get her in range to her opponent and then wreck that opponent's face. It's that simple. Now let's move on to the part that everybody loves. Thessala advanced strategies and combos. Thessala's advanced strategies all center around her unique ability. So I'll give you guys 3 tips for managing her unique ability. Number 1, try to fill up the adjacents first. Remember those 4 starting spaces that you had? Well, these are the very important ones because not only do they fuel your tempered style, which makes it even more powerful, it basically gives you more versatility when picking antis the next beat. Because you can start stretching into everywhere on the board instead of hard committing into one side and no longer being as big of a mix-up character as you usually are. So keep that in mind. Number 2, picking which one to place the tracker on. Now, Thessala has a lot of effects that are basically the same thing. She has multiple ignore stun guards, she has multiple power +1s, so on and so forth. But the key difference between them is where they are on the board. Putting your tracker onto different places on the board gives you access to different antis the next beat. So be very wary of which space you choose to cover, because sometimes covering a space near the end of the board will not be as useful as covering a space near the center of the board. Because things at the end of the board don't really branch out that much, but things near the center branch out a lot, giving Thessala more options. And again, using your unique ability to confuse your opponent is a big strength that Thessala has and is something you should take advantage of. And finally, using your cards. Thessala's cards allow her to effectively ramp across the evolution board by putting trackers onto spaces outside of the anti-phase, giving her more options for the anti the next beat. But more than that, specifically, Galvanize allows her to remove trackers from the board and put them back into her pool, meaning that that space that was previously covered can be used again. This is a very important part to remember, that because sometimes certain matchups levy on you abusing this a lot. Up against an Eligor, ignore stun guard for days. So with that in mind, manage your evolution board very well, not only by keeping the center occupied, not only by picking the correct spaces, but by also making sure that you can reuse your most powerful effects in the specific matchup. Now, which effects are the most powerful? That's all about experience and matchup knowledge. Now let's move on to some Thessala combos. Number 1, Slicing Strike. Slicing Strike is very powerful and deals a lot of potential damage if your opponent doesn't have Grasp in their hand. If you're able to get the extra power on top of this, you can deal up to 9 damage, which is an overdrive in terms of power. Not only that, but you can add power +1 to that even more by using Force Gauge. It's just quite powerful and can counter a lot of things your opponent is planning to do, and it can kill them from almost half health, which is pretty absurd if you ask me. Next up is Tempered Drive. Tempered Drive deals a ton of damage if you've set it up correctly. Tempered Drive is arguably Thessala's most annoying attack because it's basically a lot of damage for almost no cost. Thessala can then splash on even more damage on top, or give it more hit confirm, more priority, or more defense, whatever, making Tempered Drive one of her most versatile attacks if she has her evolution board correctly set up. And finally, we have Liquid Lash. Liquid Lash is what I like to call a downbeat for Thessala. Remember, your anti is not mandatory, and it's completely optional, meaning that you don't have to always use your antis. So if you need to conserve your antis for the next beat, maybe you just wanna use an attack pair that's decently good on its own and doesn't really require that much help. Well, aside from Slicing Strike and Tempered Drive being examples of those, Liquid Lash is a very good way to not only do that, but as well counter opponents who are doing slow plays that will wreck you for like 6 damage. By simply pulling them closer to you, you can either put them in range of the passive effect that makes them miss, or pull them over your head so that they miss either way, making this a very good attack should you want to conserve your life. And that pretty much does it for this episode of Battle Guides. If you guys like the video, the character, the game, do check the description down below for awesome links to the Level 99 game store. I'm sure you guys will find something you love there. I personally love BattleCON and Millennium Blades because they're freaking hype. If you guys want to talk to me or any of the other BattleCON veterans, do check the description out below for our community sites and forums. We're very friendly and very active. If you have any questions, you can also ask it there. If you want to send an email to me personally, again, my email is in the description down below. And if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, do put them in the comment section down below and I will be sure to answer. Thessala is a very interesting character and I hate her. If you thought Jaeger was an interesting mix-up monster, Thessala's that times 10. Not only are her styles so freaking good at making you wonder whether or not she's gonna use it, specifically stuff like Slicing and Tempered, or even Galvanizing, or even Liquid, all of them are quite powerful given how much they can polarize your attack pairs. She then overlaps it with a layer of, which one of my 17 antis am I gonna pick? This can be very frustrating and very annoying to fight against. But the thing about this is that she's basically a character who tries to beat out analysis people. People who usually have analysis paralysis, like me. If you're a character who usually plays on... if you're a character or a person who usually plays on instinct or just playing dumb attacks, she won't be that much of a problem, especially if she wastes some of her bigger antis on dash beats. So, with that in mind, she's not that OP, but she's really frustrating to fight against. Without much else to say, don't forget your special action, but don't forget the special action, and thank you, World of Indines. Thank you, and good night!